We tend to think of myths as tales of ancient Greeks and gods on Olympus, of unicorns and dragons. However, the most enduring myths are quite different. They hide in what you believe to be facts, things you read in textbooks and never questioned since, stories told by your teacher, passed down through generations with no one bothering to check the original sources. That's what we'll be exploring here. 30 stories, 30 revelations, 30 moments when reality proves to be far richer, stranger, and more fascinating than any fictional narrative. If you're ready to uncover the truth about the myths that have persisted for centuries, support this series with a like and share in the comments which revelation shocked you the most. It will inspire us to dig into more archives. Let's get started. Myth number 1. The hero created by an artist. December of 1776. An icy wind whips sharp needles of snow across the Delaware River. On the opposite bank, Hessian mercenaries, elite professional soldiers in the service of the British Crown, celebrating Christmas. They're not expecting an attack. No one attacks on a night like this, in such cold, across such a river, and yet an attack does occur. This moment was immortalized by the artist Emanuel Leutze in the 10,007 PT set, almost 75 years after the event itself. His monumental painting, nearly 14 feet high and 21 feet wide, quickly became an icon. George Washington stands in a boat, proudly upright, one leg forward, gazing toward the other shore. Behind him, a handful of soldiers are rowing through the ice. The painting embodies the determination, courage, and grandeur of the nation's founder. It also embodies almost everything that did not actually happen. Let's start with the most obvious. Washington did not stand in the boat. No sane military leader would do such a thing. Crossing the Delaware that night was no grand parade. It was a nightmare. The river was full of sharp ice. The boats were rocking and at risk of capsizing. A soaking wet and frozen man standing tall in the middle of such a crossing would be a suicide, not a hero. According to all historical accounts, Washington was seated, just like everyone else. But Leutze painted this scene not in America or in the 1776. He painted it in Dusseldorf during the revolutionary fervor of the 1848, when all of Europe was ablaze. For him, the image of Washington was not a historical document. It was a manifesto, a symbol of liberation meant to inspire European revolutionaries. The artist needed a hero, standing tall, visible from afar, a hero you could believe in. And he created one. Even the details of the scene in the painting, while seemingly minor, are historically inaccurate and reveal a lot. The American flag waving over the boat, the famous stars and stripes, did not even exist in December of 1776. Congress would not approve it until June of 1777. The soldiers in the painting wear uniforms that looked too neat and precise for the ragged, starving Continental Army, which was literally dying from hunger and frostbite that winter. Eyewitness accounts reveal that many had no boots, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. But now, the most important question: what really happened? The actual crossing of the Delaware was far more harrowing and monumental than the flashy portrait by Leutze suggests. Washington ferried soldiers across the icebound river in complete darkness, amid snow and biting winds. The operation took 9 hours instead of the planned 3. 18 heavy cannons were transported on flatboats. The soldiers were so exhausted that some fell asleep while marching toward Trenton. A few died from frostbite that night, not from enemy fire, but simply from the cold. And despite all of this, they attacked. And they won. They captured nearly 1,000 prisoners, losing only 2 men to enemy action. The real Washington that night wasn't a grand figure standing tall. Instead, he was a man huddled in an icy boat, gazing at the river while carrying the weight of the revolution on his shoulders. This story isn't about pose, but about willpower. Yet, the pose proved more convincing than the truth, and the painting spread around the world while the actual details of that night collected dust in archives. This myth was born from the desire to see a hero as he should be, rather than as he truly was. The next myth is of a different nature. It was born from the pride of an entire civilization that genuinely achieved something monumental, but later found out that this civilization didn't fully understand what it had done. Myth number 2, the secret that never existed. The Pantheon in Rome has stood for nearly 2,000 years. Its dome, measuring 3 meters in diameter, remained the world's largest until the 19th century. Today, when you touch its walls, there's something strange beneath your fingers. Concrete that is nearly 20 centuries old, stronger than the material used in a neighboring new build. It doesn't crack. It doesn't crumble. It stands firm. For decades, this has been regarded as one of the greatest mysteries of construction history. Scholars, engineers, and historians have recounted the same beautiful tale. The Romans possessed a secret recipe for their opus, cementitium, concrete whose secrets were lost with the fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD. The Dark Ages swallowed this knowledge, and humanity spent more than 1,000 years rediscovering what was once known. It was an enthralling story, a civilizational tragedy, almost poetic, knowledge vanishing with the empire, like the flame of a lighthouse extinguished by the GGism. Yet, nearly everything about this story is incorrect. Let's start with the lost secret. In reality, the Romans did not hide their recipes. Mark Vitruvius Pollio, an architect and engineer from the 1st century BC, wrote a 10-volume work titled On Architecture. A significant portion of this book is dedicated to a detailed description of building materials, including the compositions of concrete mixtures. This text was never lost. It was copied in monasteries throughout the Middle Ages and was widely read. Medieval builders were well aware of Roman concrete. The issue lay elsewhere. They could not recreate it. This wasn't due to an unknown recipe, but rather because a key ingredient was inaccessible outside of specific geographical regions. This ingredient was pozzolanic ash, volcanic ash with unique chemical properties that was sourced from the area around Puteoli, modern Pozzuoli, in Campania. It was mixed with lime and seawater, creating the legendary mixture that gave Romans their durable concrete. In 2069, a research team from the University of California, Berkeley, finally explained why Roman marine concrete only became stronger over time. They found that seawater permeating the structure over centuries reacted with aluminum to bermarite, a mineral formed when pozzolanic ash interacts with lime. This reaction did not weaken the concrete, as happens with modern Portland cement. Instead, it crystallized within, enhancing its strength. In other words, Roman concrete didn't just not deteriorate, it literally self-repaired over 2 millennia. The secret was not lost, it was geographically unavailable. However, geographical unavailability is a far less romantic tale than the idea of a great lost secret of a fallen civilization. This myth persisted until scientists collected samples from the docks of Caesarea Maritima and placed them under an electron microscope. It's important to note that the Romans likely didn't fully understand why their concrete performed the way it did. They knew to use pozzolanic ash and that seawater was preferable to fresh water, but the mechanism of the reaction at a molecular level was beyond their grasp. This was practical wisdom accumulated over centuries of building experience, rather than theoretical knowledge that could be documented and passed down. And therein lies the true irony of history. We spent centuries mourning a lost secret that had never vanished. It was only unraveled when we learned to examine stone through an electron microscope. This myth speaks to our tendency to envision the past as a golden age, lost due to someone's fault. The next myth addresses another human frailty, our readiness to transform a living, complex individual into a flawless icon, often in defiance of all evidence. Myth number 3. The woman who knew everything. February 1903. A laboratory on Rue Le Monde in Paris is filled with the scent of chemical reagents. At a workbench is a woman destined to receive the Nobel Prize twice. Maria Skłodowska-Curie handled radioactive materials with her bare hands. No gloves, no protective screens. She sometimes carried test tubes filled with radium in her coat pocket, noting in her diary how beautifully they glowed in the dark. For decades after her death in the World Chef Trizet Shatiti, the world shared a touching story. the great scientist who was unaware of the dangers, the pioneer who fell victim to her own discovery, a martyr of science who died in innocent ignorance. This narrative seemed particularly tragic and true. How else could one explain that the smartest woman of her time treated substances that ultimately killed her so carelessly? There is an explanation, and it is far more complex than mere ignorance. Marie Curie was aware of the dangers of radioactive radiation. In fact, she was one of the first to recognize them. As early as the beginning of the 20th century, she and her husband Pierre noted in their records that working with radioactive materials caused skin burns and irritation of mucous membranes. Pierre deliberately pressed radium samples to his skin, documenting the resulting damage. Marie herself recorded increasing fatigue, pain in her hands, and deteriorating eyesight in her letters. In 1906, following Pierre's tragic death under the wheels of a horse-drawn carriage, she continued her work. By 1921, when she traveled to the United States to receive a gift of 1 gram of radium from American women who had raised $100,000, she was so ill that she could barely stand at the ceremonial reception. By then, she had nearly gone blind from cataracts, her fingers were covered in unhealed burns, and she suffered from constant ringing in her ears. Yet she persisted. Why? Here begins the true story. Marie Curie lived in an era when the science of radiation was still in its infancy. The mechanisms of ionizing radiation, its ability to damage DNA, cause aplastic anemia, and provoke leukemia, were not yet understood. Burns and fatigue were seen as unpleasant but perhaps tolerable professional risks. The link between chronic exposure and fatal blood diseases could not be established at the time. There were neither research tools nor accumulated statistics. In other words, she knew it was dangerous, but she did not realize the full extent of that danger, and, importantly, she consciously chose to take that risk. In her personal notes, there is a phrase that is rarely quoted. She wrote that science requires researchers to be ready to sacrifice themselves for the sake of knowledge. This was not bravado, it was a conscious stance. The woman who won the Nobel Prize twice, first for the discovery of polonium and radium, and second for the study of their chemical properties, understood very well that she was paying with her own body. She chose this path. The myth of innocent ignorance is convenient because it portrays her as a victim. The real story presents her as something more complex, and perhaps more majestic, a person who glimpsed the abyss yet stepped to the brink, knowing that knowledge lay just beyond. Her working notebooks are still stored in lead-lined containers at the National Library of France. If you wish to study them, you'll be asked to sign a waiver. After 80 years, they remain too radioactive to handle barehanded. She knew, and yet she kept working. This myth of the ignorant victim gives way to another, one about a different kind of ignorance. We often think that medieval cartographers were savages drawing a flat earth, but the reality is far more complex and remarkable. Myth number 4, the flat earth no one drew. Open any popular book about the Middle Ages and you'll likely find a page depicting a disc-shaped map, a flat world surrounded by ocean with Jerusalem at the center and monsters at the edges, all captioned with the idea that this is how medieval people imagined the earth. This illustration stands as one of the most enduring historical falsehoods in Western culture. Let's clarify a fundamental fact that every educated person should know. Medieval scholars, monks, astronomers, and navigators knew perfectly well that the Earth is a sphere. This wasn't a secret revealed during the Renaissance. This knowledge didn't vanish with antiquity. Aristotle demonstrated the Earth's roundness in the 4th century BC by observing Earth's shadow on the moon during lunar eclipses. In the 3rd century BC, Eratosthenes measured the Earth's circumference with astonishing accuracy using the shadows of pillars in 2 different cities. Ptolemy developed a detailed system of spherical cartography in the 2nd century AD. And all of this was read, copied, and studied throughout the Middle Ages. So, where did the disk maps come from? This is where the truly intriguing story begins. The type of map we're discussing is called a mappa mundi, a map of the world. The most famous of these is the Hereford map, created around the year 1300. It is indeed round, with Jerusalem at the center. But to label it a flat Earth map is like claiming that the London Underground map proves the British believed in rectangular tunnels. Mappa Mundi were not navigational charts. They were theological and philosophical diagrams. They depicted not geography, but the meaningful structure of the universe, a sacred history arranged in space. Jerusalem is at the center because it is the spiritual heart of the Christian world, not because the monk thought it was the geographic pole of the earth. Paradise is to the east because, in Christian symbolism, the east signifies beginnings and rebirth. The monsters at the edges represent the frontier of the known world, the place of the unknown. The people who created these maps also utilized portolan charts, detailed navigational maps whose accuracy is still astonishing today. Genoese and Catalan navigators in the 13th and 14th centuries had Mediterranean portolans that were so precise that computer analysis in the 20th century revealed an error margin of only a few %. These maps did not assume a flat Earth. They required an understanding of the curvature of the surface for accurate distance calculations. So, where did the myth come from? It was literally invented in the 19th century. The American writer Washington Irving, in his fictional biography of Christopher Columbus, published in One Thing Jaziva Teen, created a scene where Columbus argues with ignorant medieval monks who believe in a flat Earth. Nothing like that actually happened. In reality, scholars of that time opposed Columbus for a different reason. They believed he underestimated the distance to Asia. And they were right. Columbus was off by nearly 20,000 kilometers in his calculations. He was only saved by a continent that no one even suspected existed. The myth of the medieval flat Earth is not a historical account. It is a propaganda tool created in the age of positivism to illustrate how science triumphs over religious darkness. It didn't win because it never fought that battle. This was a falsehood in favor of progress. And the next story revolves around a myth that took root through a different mechanism. Sheer geographical ignorance that has sprouted countless legends. Myth number 5. Tea that came directly from the East. In Russia, tea is enjoyed in a unique way, served with a lump of sugar, in a glass holder, with a saucer, distinct from the rest of Europe in both style and taste. Russian tea traditions are so distinctive that one might think they must have a unique history. And indeed, that history exists, but it isn't the one typically told. Most people, if asked where tea came from in Russia, would likely respond something like this. It came through Europe, along with other Western trends, like coffee, tobacco, and elaborate waistcoats. The era of Peter the Great, Europeanization, tea from Holland or Britain. This is fundamentally incorrect. Tea made its way into Russia from the East, not just from the East in a broad sense, but through a remarkably precise route that represents one of the greatest trading tales in human history. And this happened nearly 100 years before tea became popular in Western Europe. In the Russian envoy Vasily Starkov returned from Mongolia, bringing an unusual gift to Tsar Mikhail Fyodorovich from the Mongolian Khan Altan, several kilograms of dried leaves. The Khan presented them as a valuable medicinal remedy. The royal court tried the drink and initially received it with little enthusiasm. Legend has it that Starkov even tried to decline the gift, finding it too modest for a diplomatic exchange. But the Khan insisted. This seemingly random incident launched one of the most significant trade arteries in history. In the 1689, Russia and China signed the Treaty of Nerchinsk, the first official treaty between the two powers. One of its major outcomes was the establishment of regular trade along the so-called Tea Road, a route through Kyakhta, a border trading city where Russian furs were exchanged for Chinese tea. This route was established even before the maritime trade routes of East India companies began supplying tea to Western Europe. The Kyakhta tea route stretches 18,000 kilometers through Mongolia, Siberia, and the European part of Russia. Camel and horse caravans traveled for months. This long overland journey shaped the distinctive flavors of Russian tea drinking. Tea transported such long distances developed different taste qualities compared to that brought by fast sea vessels. Russians became accustomed to a stronger, richer, and slightly smoky flavor. This came to be regarded as the authentic tea experience. By the 18th century, tea consumption in Russia had surged to such an extent that the samovar, a symbol of Russian tea culture, became a national household item, produced in large factories in Tula. Meanwhile, the British East India Company was just starting to ramp up its tea operations. By the late 19th century, the Trans-Siberian Railway was built, partially following the routes established by tea caravans 200 years earlier. Tea arrived in Russia from the east, directly traversing steppes and mountains long before it became a European trend. The myth of a European origin for Russian tea culture results from a misunderstanding of how vast and interconnected Eurasia was even in the 17th century. This myth stems from geographic ignorance. The next myth relates to a different kind of ignorance, our tendency to project qualities onto historical figures that we prefer to see in them. Myth number 6, the Gandhi we don't know. The name Gandhi has become synonymous with absolute nonviolence. In contemporary culture, it has turned into a sort of logo for pacifism, so universal that it's often mentioned alongside figures like Buddha and Martin Luther King in discussions about peaceful resistance. His quotes on nonviolence are embroidered on pillows and printed on mugs. His image appears monolithic and unambiguous. The real Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was a far more complex, controversial, and at times shockingly different figure. Let's start with an uncomfortable fact about this image. Gandhi actively supported participation in military conflicts on 2 occasions in his life, urging others to do the same. The first instance was in 1899, during the Second Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. At that time, living in Natal, Gandhi organized the Indian Ambulance Corps to serve British troops. He personally recruited volunteers, convincing them that supporting the war on Britain's side was a moral obligation, a way to demonstrate loyalty to the empire and thereby improve the standing of the Indian community in South Africa. The Corps comprised over 1,000 volunteers. They did not carry weapons, but they facilitated the operation of a military machine that killed people. The second instance occurred in the 1906 during the suppression of the rebellion led by Zulu chief Bambatha. Gandhi again organized an Indian ambulance corps for British troops quelling this uprising. In his letters, he described how his men carried wounded British soldiers off the battlefield while Zulus lay dying nearby. He would later write that it was in this moment, witnessing the suffering of the Zulus, that something new began to form within him. But back in 1906, he was firmly on the British side. In 1909, when Gandhi returned to India, he once again answered the British call, this time to support World War I. He actively recruited Indian volunteers for the British Army, traveling through Gujarat and giving speeches about duty. This drew sharp criticism even from his own supporters. How could a man who preached nonviolence urge others to go out and kill? Gandhi had a response, a complex philosophical one that he developed throughout his life. At its core was the idea that the principle of nonviolence, or ahimsa, is an ideal to strive for. However, a living person in an imperfect world sometimes faces a choice between 2 forms of violence. Supporting one side over another might be a lesser evil in specific circumstances. Nonviolence is not an absolute prohibition against participating in conflict, but rather a mindset that requires continuous, painful choices. This is a profound and honest position. Yet, it stands in stark contrast to the image of a flawless saint in a white dhoti, whose likeness is captured on cushions adorned with embroidered quotes. There was also another aspect of his views that is often overlooked. His early writings about the inhabitants of South Africa contain remarks that are undeniably racist by today's standards. He spoke of black people and Zulus in terms incompatible with the image of a humanitarian. He later revised many of these views, but they existed. This evolution, this journey from prejudice to humanity, makes his story far more relatable and significant than the pristine legend of a born pacifist. The real Gandhi is a story about a man who changed, a man who made mistakes, reevaluated his beliefs, sometimes contradicted himself, and through this painful self-reflection, created something that truly transformed the world. This myth was born from our need for unblemished heroes. The next myth arises from a completely different need, the desire of elite institutions to control their image. Myth number 7. The Foreign Legion that wasn't there. The French Foreign Legion. Just saying the words evokes a unique allure. Adventurers without a past. Runaways from the law and broken hearts. People who approach a recruiter devoid of identity, only to receive a new one. Germans, Russians, Spaniards, Americans, every nation united under one banner with the battle cry, "Legion is our homeland." This is true. Yet, within this truth lies a detail often overlooked because it disrupts the appealing narrative. There have always been a significant number of Frenchmen serving in the French Foreign Legion. The Legion was established in the 1833 by King Louis Philippe, specifically to utilize foreign soldiers in France's colonial wars. The idea was politically elegant. If Germans and Swiss die in Algeria or Madagascar, it raises far fewer eyebrows in the National Assembly than if French citizens were lost there. They served as foreign bodies to support French imperial ambitions. Because of this, the Legion officially did not accept French citizens. However, in reality, Frenchmen always made up a significant portion of the legionnaires, a fact supported by the Legion's own historical records. The process was straightforward. A Frenchman would approach a recruiter, provide a fictitious name, and claim to be Belgian, Swiss, or Luxembourgish. The recruiter would listen, recognize the accent of a fellow countryman, and simply enter Belgian in the records. No one ever checked. It was such a well-known occurrence that within the Legion, there was an unofficial term for these men. Légionnaire belge, Belgian legionnaire, became a euphemism for a Frenchman hiding behind a foreign identity. Officers were aware of this. The leadership knew. It was an open secret, maintained because the Legion needed soldiers, and young Frenchmen sometimes needed to disappear to escape debts, family disputes, or criminal prosecution. The rule prohibiting French citizens would eventually be officially revised. Starting in 1932, Frenchmen were allowed to join the Legion openly. Today, French citizens make up about 24% of all legionnaires, the largest single national group. Foreign Legion has always been full of Frenchmen. They just pretended to be someone else, much like many genuine foreigners who join the Legion under assumed names. This doesn't tarnish the romance of the Legion. Rather, it makes it more genuine. It was an institution created for those who wanted to become someone else. It didn't matter who you were before. The Legion welcomed everyone, even those posing as foreigners while being French. If this myth about the famed institution surprises you, the next, about a legendary event, will be even more shocking. Because the Wright brothers' first flight, which was supposed to change the world, went unnoticed by the world itself. Myth number 8. A triumph no one saw. On December 3-7, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. A deserted beach, cold winds from the Atlantic. Orville Wright climbs into a homemade aircraft, while his brother Wilbur holds a wing to assist with the takeoff. The engine coughs to life. The flyer lifts off the ground. 12 seconds. 37 meters. The first powered controlled flight in human history. That day, the brothers made 4 flights. The longest lasted 59 seconds, covering 260 meters. 5 witnesses observed this event, 4 local residents and 1 lifeguard. Upon returning home to Dayton, the brothers sent a telegram to their father. Success, 4 flights on Thursday morning, all against a 21-mile-per-hour wind. How did the world react to this discovery? With an explosion of excitement? Sensational headlines in newspapers? Immediate recognition of the greatest technological breakthrough of the century? No. The newspapers that the Wright brothers sent their press release to largely ignored the story or printed it on their inside pages with factual errors. The Dayton newspaper, local to the Wrights, ran a headline like, "Dayton boys fly." No details, no understanding of the event's significance. Why? Partly because, in the same year of 1903, there were several other contenders for the title of first flight, and the public had grown tired of sensational claims, most of which turned out to be false or exaggerated. Additionally, the Wright brothers themselves were not publicity experts. They were bicycle mechanics from rural Ohio, without advanced degrees or backing from the scientific establishment. But the main reason was different. The first flights were quite modest compared to what was promised. 37 meters is roughly a third of a football field. The audience needed to see something far more impressive to believe. Over the next 2 years, the brothers refined their design in total solitude, without an audience, without journalists, without government funding. By the 2005, the Flyer 3 could stay in the air for over 30 minutes and perform complex maneuvers. The brothers even wrote to the U.S. War Department, offering to sell their invention. They received a rejection. The committee deemed the project premature. When Wilbur Wright arrived in France in 1908 and performed public flights over the Le Mans airfield, Europe erupted. French newspapers spoke of a revolution. Crowds came to watch again and again. French aviators, who considered themselves the leaders in aviation, were caught off guard. The brothers had leaped ahead by several years. It took 5 years for the world to notice an invention that changed everything. The first flight was met not with excitement, but with silence. Because the world was not ready to grasp what had happened on that beach in December of 1903. This myth reflects our deafness to great events. The next one concerns our tendency to simplify political catastrophes into digestible narratives. Myth number 9. The beer hall putsch that failed forever. November 9, 1923. Munich. Adolf Hitler emerges from the Bürgerbräu beer hall at the head of a column of stormtroopers heading toward the city center. Ahead lies a police barricade. Gunshots ring out. 16 Nazis and 4 police officers are killed. Hitler falls to the ground, either wounded or hiding. The coup has failed. He is arrested. Often, this is where the story of the beer hall putsch ends. A failed attempt to seize power by force, after which Hitler recognized the need to come to power through elections. This is true, but it's only half the story, and the other half changes everything. At his trial, Hitler turned his defeat into a triumph. The process was broadcast across all of Germany. Hitler spoke for hours, blaming the Weimar Republic, the Jews, and the November criminals. Judges sympathetic to the nationalists allowed him to speak. Newspapers printed his speeches. In just 1 week of the trial, Hitler gained nationwide fame that he had never had before. Before the coup, he was a provincial politician in Bavaria. After the trial, he emerged as a national figure. The verdict was astonishingly lenient. 5 years in prison with the possibility of early release at Landsberg Fortress with comfortable conditions. He was released after just 9 months. During those 9 months, he dictated Mein Kampf. Moreover, the coup changed his strategy. Hitler realized that a military takeover was impossible. The army and police would not support it. Elections were necessary. He directed all his energy towards building an electoral machine, a cult of personality around his oratory, and a propaganda apparatus. In this sense, the beer hall putsch did not fail. It transformed. The defeat of 8,623 Nazis in the streets of Munich became the start of a political career that would 10 years later bring their leader to power through seemingly legitimate means. The Nazi Party didn't come to power through a coup. But without the coup, and without the trial that turned Hitler into a national martyr, things could have turned out very differently. The myth of failure hides a much darker story, one about how defeat can be a prelude to victory if used correctly. The following story is about another kind of victory, about a man we remember as a revolutionary, but who merely completed a work that others had begun. Myth number 10, an evolution not by Darwin. November 24, 1859, London. A book titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection hits the shelves. The author is Charles Darwin. The first edition of 1250 copies sells out on the very first day. Since then, Darwin's name has become inseparable from the theory of evolution, so much so that most people view them as synonyms. Darwin's theory, Darwinian evolution. It gives the impression that no one considered it before him. This is, to put it lightly, an exaggeration. To be more blunt, it is an injustice to those whose ideas Darwin developed, clarified, and systematized. Let's start with the most obvious. Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, published a poem called Zoonomia in 1796, in which he explored ideas of transmutation of species, that is, their change over time. He explicitly wrote that all warm-blooded creatures could have descended from a common ancestor. This was 63 years before the origin of species. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck published Philosophie zoologique in 1809, the first systematic theory of biological evolution. His mechanism, inheritance of acquired traits, would later be disproven, but the idea that species change over time was articulated clearly and comprehensively. However, the most important and least known figure in this story is Alfred Russel Wallace. In February 1858, Charles Darwin received a letter from Malaysia. It was written by a young naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who was working in the field on the Moluccas Islands. In this letter, Wallace outlined the theory of natural selection, almost word for word what Darwin had been secretly working on for the past 20 years. For Darwin, it was a shock. He realized that if he didn't publish his work immediately, Wallace would get ahead of him and take all the credit. Wallace's letter compelled Darwin, who was a perfectionist by nature and had delayed publishing for years, to finally release his book. A gentleman's agreement was reached through intermediaries. In July, at a meeting of the Linnaean Society in London, Darwin's manuscript and Wallace's essay were read simultaneously to establish joint priority. At that time, Wallace was on the other side of the world and learned of this post hoc. According to him, he didn't mind. He was thrilled by the scope of Darwin's work. However, history remembers Darwin. In part, it's because his book was vastly more detailed and supported by evidence. Additionally, he had connections in the British scientific establishment, while Wallace did not. And partly, it's simply because history tends to favor one name over two. Evolution is not the idea of a single individual. It is a concept that developed in several minds at once. Darwin contributed the most to its evidence, but to label it solely as his theory is to overlook the people who could have brought it to light differently or later. This myth of the solitary genius is one of the most enduring in the history of science. The next myth is about another persistent misconception, this time regarding those we tend to pity. Myth number 11. Peasants who had more leisure than us. When we think of a medieval peasant, a specific image comes to mind. A hunched figure over a plow, toiling from dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Life appears as a relentless ordeal under the watchful eye of a harsh lord. This image is largely a fabrication. Moreover, it conveniently serves multiple ideologies, for those wanting to highlight the progress of capitalism and for those wishing to showcase its horrors. The former would say, "Look how far we've come from medieval poverty." The latter would argue, "Look at how capitalism has turned free people into serfs." Both relied on the same caricature of the medieval peasant. In reality, the medieval peasant, by some accounts, had more days off than the modern office worker. Research by medievalists, particularly the work of Juliet Shore published in the 1990s, has shown the following. The medieval Catholic calendar included, depending on the region and period, from 52 Sundays plus 40 to 60 feast days in a year. This meant that a third, and often more than a third, of the year was officially dedicated to religious holidays, during which work was strictly forbidden, not merely discouraged but outright prohibited by church regulations. On top of that, the agricultural year had a distinct seasonality. Winter in medieval Europe was a time of minimal activity. The main farming tasks, plowing, planting, and harvesting, were concentrated in relatively short periods. During the gaps between these peaks, there was significantly less work. It's crucial to understand that the very concept of a workday in the Middle Ages was fundamentally different. There was no notion of an 8-hour workday, neither as a norm nor as an ideal. People worked while there was light and tasks to be done, then they stopped. Breaks were taken for meals, conversations, and prayers. The modern idea of continuous working hours is a product of the Industrial Revolution, not the feudal system. This doesn't mean that the life of a medieval peasant was easy. It was hard, dangerous, and unpredictable. Crop failures meant famine. Illness led to death. Armies passing through a village brought devastation. The average life expectancy was low, and child mortality was high. However, there is a significant difference between a life full of dangers and endless toil with no days off. A medieval peasant was not a workaholic in the way we understand the term today. They experienced time differently, more intermittently, closely tied to natural cycles, festivals, and community life. The image of a peasant working without rest is ironically reminiscent of the industrial worker in the 19th century, projected back into history. It was during this time that 12-hour shifts without weekends became the norm. It was then that the holidays, which the church had protected for centuries, disappeared. Industrial capitalism did to working time what feudalism never did. The next myth also illustrates how we often fail to see things as they truly are. In this case, it concerns stone. Myth number 12. The missing nose. The Great Sphinx of Giza stares eastward with empty eye sockets and a noseless stone face. This is an all too familiar image, so familiar that few people question when exactly the nose vanished. If you ask most people, they might say something like, Napoleon. His troops used the Sphinx for artillery practice. Some might mention the Crusaders. Others might just shrug. However, there is well-documented evidence that points to a specific individual and a specific time. The Arab historian al-Makrizi recorded a tale in the 15th century about a religious fanatic named Muhammad Sa'im al-Dar. In 1378, this man approached the Sphinx and deliberately broke off its nose upon seeing local peasants offering sacrifices to it as an idol. He was arrested and executed, not for destroying a historical monument, but for causing economic damage as his actions stirred up unrest. This account dates back to 1378, nearly 420 years before Napoleon's arrival in Egypt. The version involving Napoleon emerged later and is based on absolutely zero evidence. Ironically, Napoleon's complicated reputation in Egypt fueled the narrative, leading people to attribute various misdeeds to him during his time there. There is not a single document, no eyewitness testimony, nor military report mentioning the Sphinx being shelled. However, there are drawings by European artists who visited Egypt before Napoleon's expedition, and in all these illustrations, the Sphinx is already missing its nose. Interestingly, earlier medieval Arab sources describe the Sphinx with a nose. It seems that the nose existed for centuries after the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century. Images of the Sphinx with a nose appear in texts all the way up to the 14th century, coinciding with the timeline provided by al-Makrizi. Another aspect often overlooked is that the Sphinx was originally painted, not just grayish-yellow limestone, but vibrant colors. Traces of red paint remain on its neck. The face was likely red, a traditional color for depicting male faces in ancient Egyptian art. This makes our typical image of the ancient gray Sphinx as inaccurate as thinking a faded copy of the Sistine Chapel reflects how it looked during Michelangelo's time. Napoleon didn't destroy the Sphinx's nose. It disappeared 4 centuries before he arrived. This doesn't absolve him of other significant destruction caused during his Egyptian campaign, but the Sphinx is not his doing. This myth persists because we need a specific culprit. The nameless religious iconoclasm of the 14th century isn't as compelling as a notorious villain in a tricorn hat. The next myth highlights our tendency to oversimplify, this time regarding the people we consider representatives of a single nation. Myth number 13. The Apostles We Don't Know. The 12 Apostles. In popular perception, these are 12 Jews from Judea, the closest followers of Jesus of Nazareth, a Galilean. A homogeneous group from a single cultural background. This simplification conceals a much more intriguing picture. Let's start with the most obvious example, Simon the Zealot, or Simon the Canaanite. His title, Zealot, directly points to his association with the Zealots, a Jewish revolutionary movement advocating armed resistance against Roman occupation. This was not merely a religious group, it was a political faction that viewed violence against the occupiers as a legitimate tool. Now consider Matthew, or Levi. He was a tax collector working for the Romans. In the eyes of Jewish society at that time, this was not just an unpleasant profession. Tax collectors were considered collaborators, traitors to their people. They worked for the occupiers, profiting at the expense of their fellow countrymen, and were excluded from normal religious and social life within their communities. In other words, among the 12 apostles, there was both an anti-Roman revolutionary and a man who collaborated with Rome. It's like putting a partisan and a policeman from an occupying force in the same group. But let's go further. Andrew and Peter were fishing brothers from Bethsaida, a town with a predominantly Greek population. The very name Bethsaida is Greek. Andrew has a Greek name. In the Gospel of John, it's Andrew and Philip who are approached by some Greeks wanting to see Jesus. This suggests that Andrew spoke Greek and acted as a mediator between a Greek-speaking audience and their Aramaic-speaking teacher. Philip also has a distinctly Greek name and hails from the same town of Bethsaida. This further points to a cultural environment deeply influenced by Hellenism rather than a purely Jewish one. There's no reason to believe that any of the apostles were not of Jewish descent. However, they lived in a world where Jewish, Greek, Aramaic, and Roman cultures blended so deeply that the idea of a homogeneous national group became meaningless. First-century Galilee was literally a cultural melting pot. Judas, the betrayer of the apostolic group, was likely from Kerioth in Judea, making him the only true Judean among a team of Galileans. This is no incidental detail. The gospel text underscores the ethnic difference between him and the others. The makeup of the apostles reflects the real diversity of first-century Palestinian society, with its political factions, cultural layers, and linguistic boundaries. It was not a homogeneous brotherhood, but something much more complex and, perhaps, more human. The next myth comes from a different cultural tradition, but it speaks to the same theme: our attempts to reduce complex realities to a single, simple cause. Myth number 14. A war that wasn't about a woman. The face that launched 1,000 ships. This is how Christopher Marlowe described Helen of Troy. The most beautiful woman in the world, either abducted or having run away with the Trojan prince Paris. A decade-long war, thousands of deaths, the fall of a great city, all because of one woman. It's a beautiful story. It has existed for 3,000 years. It's so well crafted narratively that it almost feels wrong to dismantle it. But even within Homer's own texts, this version doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And if we step beyond the Iliad and look at what historians and archaeologists have discovered about the late Bronze Age in the Aegean region, the picture becomes quite different. Let's start with Homer. The Iliad isn't a tale about the causes of war. It's a story about Achilles' wrath, about honor, insult, friendship, and death. Helen appears only rarely in the text, and, during the famous scene on the walls of Troy, she looks at the fighting men with weary bitterness, calling herself a bitch and the source of all woes. This is not a portrait of a triumphant beauty-inspiring war. It's a depiction of a victim of fate, exhausted by the chaos around her. When it comes to the real reasons behind the conflict, Troy was indeed a real city, identified with the Hisarlik Mound in present-day Turkey. The Trojan War, if it had a historical basis, occurred around the 12th to 13th centuries BCE, during a period of significant crisis in the late Bronze Age, when several advanced civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed almost simultaneously. Troy controlled the Hellespont Strait, the entrance to the Black Sea. This was a strategically vital point for trade, where amber, grain, and metals from the north passed through. The Greek city-states, reliant on Black Sea trade, had strong economic reasons to control this route. Hittite archives decoded in the 20th century contain numerous references to conflicts in western Anatolia, a region the Hittites called Wilusa, which linguists relate to the Greek Ilium. Hittite texts mention Greek Achaeans warriors in this area. This is not mythology, it's diplomatic correspondence. If a real war took place, it was fought for control over trade routes, hegemony in the region, and resources. This doesn't mean that abductions of women didn't happen. They were a common aspect of the era. Yet, attributing the conflict solely to a woman is a poetic image crafted to give it a more human scale. Telling the story through the lens of Helen represents a literary genius of Homer. However, to take this as a historical explanation would be a mistake. The next myth is also about war, but one that is much closer to our time. Myth number 15. The secret that wasn't a secret. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb obliterated Hiroshima. The world was shocked. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan. The war came to an end. Immediately, a myth emerged in the West, that Soviet intelligence only learned about the atomic bomb when it fell on the Japanese city, that the Manhattan Project was completely airtight, that Stalin was caught off guard. Stalin was not caught off guard. He had detailed knowledge of the Manhattan Project from the very beginning. The Soviet intelligence operation to infiltrate the American atomic program began long before the first American reactor achieved critical mass. The network of Soviet agents within the Manhattan Project was one of the most successful intelligence operations of the 20th century. Klaus Fuchs, a German physicist working in Los Alamos, passed detailed technical drawings and calculations to Soviet intelligence starting in 2014. David Greenglass relayed information through his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius. Theodore Hall, a brilliant physicist who joined Los Alamos at the age of 18, became a Soviet agent of his own accord, convinced that America's monopoly on nuclear weapons posed a danger to world peace. By the time the first American bomb was tested at Trinity, New Mexico, in July 2060, Soviet intelligence had gathered enough information for its physicists to begin working on their own bomb. The Soviet atomic project, led by Igor Kurchatov, began in the 1060-12, just 1 year after the start of the Manhattan Project. A famous moment at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. President Truman casually informed Stalin that the United States possesses a weapon of unusual destructive power. Truman watched Stalin's reaction, expecting surprise. Stalin, however, responded composedly, expressing hope that it would be used against Japan, and quickly moved on to other topics. Winston Churchill, who witnessed the scene, concluded that Stalin didn't get the hint. Churchill was mistaken. Stalin understood perfectly because he already knew everything. Returning to the Soviet delegation, he immediately ordered an acceleration of their work. The first Soviet atomic bomb was detonated in August of 1945, just 4 years after Hiroshima. American experts had predicted that the Soviet project would take 10 to 20 years, but intelligence reports cut that timeline in half. The myth of the sealed Manhattan Project conceals one of the greatest counterintelligence failures in history. The next myth is of a different kind, a geographic ignorance that has become an international oddity. Myth number 16, the capital that doesn't appear on postcards. If you've ever asked a stranger on the street where the capital of Australia is, there's a high chance the answer would be Sydney, sometimes Melbourne. Rarely would you get the correct answer. The capital of Australia is Canberra, a city built from scratch in the early 20th century, literally conjured from political compromise. The story of its creation is a small masterpiece of human irony. When, in the scattered Australian colonies united into a federation, the immediate question arose, where should the capital be located? Sydney and Melbourne, the country's two largest and most powerful cities, clashed over this issue with a fervor that seemed incompatible with the image of the calm and friendly Australian. Sydney residents viewed their city as the obvious capital. It's the oldest, the most famous, and the gateway to Australia. Melbourne disagreed, claiming to be the wealthiest, the most European, and a true cultural center. Both sides presented compelling arguments and were adamant about not conceding to the other. The constitutional resolution was absurdly elegant. The capital was to be located in New South Wales, where Sydney is, but more than 100 miles away from Sydney itself. This meant that the capital would exist in a neutral zone, far enough so neither rival could claim victory. In 1908, an international competition was held to design the new capital. The winner was American architect Walter Burley Griffin from Chicago, who proposed a garden city around an artificial lake. Canberra was officially named in 1913 when Lady Denman, the wife of the Governor-General, opened a bottle of wine over the cornerstone. The name Canberra has an uncertain origin, most likely from the Ngunnawal language, meaning something like meeting place or place of the woman with breasts. What's particularly noteworthy is that even when Canberra was already established and functioning as the capital, Melbourne remained the de facto capital for another 25 years, as that's where Parliament met. The official relocation of Parliament to Canberra only took place in 1927. The construction of the new Parliament House stretched on for another 60 years, finally opening in 1928. The myth of Sydney as the capital persists mainly because Sydney is the tourist face of Australia, synonymous with the iconic Opera House and the Harbour Bridge. Canberra, on the other hand, represents the administrative side of Australia, intentionally modest and neutral. It was created not as a showcase, but as a compromise. And compromises don't make for the most exciting imagery on tourist postcards. The next myth revolves around another compromise, but this time in the realm of knowledge, who we credit with the invention of the university. Myth number 17. The university that wasn't first. The University of Bologna, founded in 1918 AD. Officially recognized as the oldest university in the world, it's a source of pride for Italian culture and a hallmark of European civilization. This, however, is inaccurate, or rather, it depends on what we define as a university. If we consider a university to be an institution of higher learning offering degrees in multiple disciplines, then Bologna is indeed one of the very early examples of this in Europe. But if we talk about an institution of higher learning that systematically teaches various sciences and awards qualifications, then the history is much longer and more complex. Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, Morocco, founded in 1957 AD, that's 228 years before Bologna. The Guinness World Records recognizes Al-Qarawiyyin as the oldest existing educational institution in the world. It was founded by a woman, Fatima al-Fihri, daughter of a wealthy merchant from Kairouan. She inherited her father's fortune and spent it entirely on establishing an educational institution that still operates today. Al-Azhar in Cairo. Established in 875 AD, it has been continuously functioning for over 1,000 years. It is one of the leading Islamic universities in the world, with a long-standing tradition of teaching theology, law, grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, and astronomy. Nalanda in India. This Buddhist monastery university operated from the 5th to the 13th century AD and, at its peak, housed around 10,000 students and 2,000 teachers. Students traveled from China, Korea, Japan, Tibet, and Central Asia. Historical accounts describe Nalanda's library as occupying several multi-story buildings and containing millions of manuscripts. Unfortunately, all of this was destroyed during the Mongol invasion. The myth of the first university in Europe being the first university in the world is a classic example of Eurocentrism in the history of education. This notion didn't arise from malice, but rather from a tendency to write world history from a European perspective. Bologna was the first in Europe to establish the legal structure we now associate with universities: formal degrees, a charter, and corporate status for students. However, claiming it as the first of its kind in Europe and the first in the world are fundamentally different assertions. This myth highlights how cultures assert their own primacy. Next, we explore how cultures create myths about great individuals. Myth number 18, the self-made hero. Theodore Roosevelt. One of the most physically active presidents in American history, G-gay game hunter, cowboy, colonel of the Rough Riders who conquered Cuba during the Spanish-American War, a symbol of masculinity and physical strength. Few people know that as a child, he struggled with severe asthma. Theodore Roosevelt was born in October 1858 in New York City to a wealthy family. From an early age, he suffered from intense asthma attacks, so severe that his family doubted he would live to adulthood. In his memoirs, he recounted nights spent gasping for breath, propped up on pillows as his father carried him around the room in a bid to alleviate his suffering. His parents took him to the mountains for fresh air and tried every medical treatment available at the time. His father played a crucial role in what happened next. One day, when Teddy was about 12, his father took him to a small gym and said something like, "You have a strong mind, but your body will fail you if you don't build it up. You need to create your own body." And Theodore began to work on it. It was a years-long, methodical, and often painful process. He took up boxing, despite barely being able to breathe after each session. He wrestled, rode, and rode horses. Gradually and very slowly, his lungs grew stronger. His asthma attacks became less frequent. By the age of 20, he had transformed into a man of remarkable physical strength. But the asthma never fully disappeared. President Roosevelt continued to suffer from attacks throughout his life. He simply learned to work through them. His story of physical transformation was well known in his time. He eagerly shared it, understanding the propagandistic value of a narrative about a man who made himself from a weak body. Over time, however, the story was simplified. Only the image of the hero remained, obscuring the feat of will that had created that image. This changes the significance of his physical achievements. The chest wound he sustained during a campaign speech in 2029, he continued speaking for another hour and a half with a bullet in his chest, is not just an anecdote about a lucky politician. It's a continuation of the same story. A man whose body had been trying to defeat him since childhood learned to ignore physical pain as a normal part of life. The true story is often more compelling than the myth. The next myth we'll explore involves a different kind of transformation, chronological this time. Myth 19. The revolution that happened in November. The Great October Socialist Revolution. October of 1917. In Soviet-era textbooks and those of the post-Soviet space, in revolutionary marches and posters, October, October, October. However, the revolution actually occurred in November, on November 7, 1917, according to the new calendar. This is not a typo or a minor inconsistency. It results from one of the longest calendar discrepancies in European history. In 1917, Russia was still using the Julian calendar, the old style introduced by Julius Caesar in 46 BC. By the 20th century, the Julian calendar lagged 13 days behind the Gregorian calendar, adopted by most countries. Western Europe transitioned to the Gregorian calendar in the 16th and 17th centuries, while Russia only made the switch after the revolution, in February 1918. October 25 in the old style corresponds to November 7 in the new style. The Soviet government was fully aware of this discrepancy. Officially, the revolution was termed October based on the old calendar date. The Soviet Union celebrated the anniversary on November Set, which is the new style, while still retaining the name October. This linguistic construction led to November celebrations being labeled as October events. People grew accustomed to this and no longer noticed the contradiction. This isn't the only confusion in Russian revolutionary chronology. The February Revolution, which overthrew the Tsar, took place in February according to the old calendar, which means it was in March by the new calendar. In Russia, Valentine's Day is celebrated on February 14, while the Old New Year is observed on January 13, a direct result of the same calendar difference. Crucially, the Bolsheviks of 1917 were aware of which calendar they were using. Lenin dated his documents as October 25. When the Winter Palace was taken, it was, by their clocks and their calendar, indeed still October. But to the outside world, living by the Gregorian calendar, it was November. The myth isn't that the revolution is called October. That's historically correct for those who carried it out. The myth lies in our unconscious assumption that the date in the textbook matches our familiar calendar. The next myth also deals with the discrepancy between image and reality. This time, it's about the most famous teetotaler of the 20th century, who was not. Myth 20. The teetotaler who drank from the wrong bottle. Winston Churchill and alcohol have spawned an entire genre of historical anecdotes. Madam, I may be drunk now, but in the morning I will be sober, and you will still be ugly. A whiskey and soda perpetually in hand in all his photographs, a bottle of brandy on the nightstand. Churchill is a symbol of a functioning alcoholic in power during one of history's darkest times. Here's a translation suitable for voice narration. There's a myth connected to Winston Churchill that some claim he was moderate or even abstinent before World War II or at some point in his life. Certain popular biographers attempted to craft a narrative of a, quote, sober Churchill who turned to drinking because of the war. This, however, is not true. Churchill drank throughout most of his adult life, methodically, generously, and with great pleasure. His first encounter with alcohol dates back to his military service in India in the 1890s, when the young officer discovered that whiskey and soda served as a solid defense against dysentery in the scorching climate. To some extent, this was a medical judgment of the time. Alcohol was viewed as an antimicrobial. Yet, the real historical myth plays out differently. There is a genuine story about how Churchill once actually gave up alcohol. In 1936, when he was diagnosed with serious digestive issues, doctors strongly advised him to abstain. According to some reports, he followed this advice for a while and publicly lamented it as one of the greatest trials of his life. But there's a far more intriguing facet to this story. Churchill devised a highly complex set of personal rules regarding alcohol that allowed him to drink heavily while believing himself to be fully in control. He never consumed strong drinks straight. His famous whiskey and soda was quite weak, almost ceremonial. He would stretch brandy over several hours. According to his personal secretary, Churchill was convinced that he was drinking correctly and that alcohol posed no harm to him. Whether this was true from a medical standpoint remains an open question. However, what's critical to understand is that the image of a sober Churchill, or the notion that he became a drunk only because of the war, is a distortion. He drank throughout his life and managed an empire while waging a world war, all with a glass in hand. This myth reflects our desire to find periods of virtue in great individuals. The next myth concerns the grand structures that we often misunderstand. Myth number 21. Lighthouses that were more than just fire. The Lighthouse of Alexandria. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. With varying estimates of its height from 100 to 150 meters, a flame at its peak, visible from 50 kilometers away. When we envision this lighthouse, our imagination conjures a massive tower with a fire burning at the top, perhaps in a metal cauldron. Fire and smoke, both primitive and majestic at the same time. This depiction simplifies the reality to such a degree that it in itself becomes a sort of miracle of oversimplification. Ancient sources describing the Lighthouse of Alexandria mention several details that don't fit the notion of just a tall tower with fire. Strabo, who visited the lighthouse around the time of Augustus, along with other writers, notes that the beacon's light could be seen not just far away, but also under night conditions, from distances technically impossible for an open flame without some amplification system. According to several historians and experts in ancient technology, the ancient lighthouse used metallic mirrors, polished bronze reflectors that concentrated and directed light. This is not mere speculation. Figures like Hero of Alexandria and other ancient mechanics wrote treatises on the use of metallic mirrors for light effects. The technology was well known. Applying it in a lighthouse was both logical and practical. Moreover, there are mentions that the lighthouse could serve not only as a navigational landmark, but also as a sort of long-range observation system. If mirrors could concentrate and project light over great distances, then, with the right orientation, they could theoretically allow for the observation of distant objects as well. While this is speculative and lacks direct evidence, the concept of a primitive telescope made of polished bronze is not far-fetched for the level of Alexandrian science. The lighthouse functioned for about 500 to 600 years. It sustained damage from a series of earthquakes in the 14th century and was repurposed as a source of building stone for the Mamluk fortress of Kite Bay, which stands on its site to this day. Underwater expeditions in the harbor of Alexandria have uncovered enormous stone blocks, some of which have been identified as fragments of the lighthouse. Describing it as just a tall tower with a fire is akin to calling the Antikythera mechanism just a piece of bronze. The reality is far more complex and fascinating. Now, let's explore the next myth, about a man who is often credited with more than he actually achieved. Myth number 22, the president who wasn't Benjamin Franklin. One of the founding fathers of the United States, a great scientist, diplomat, writer, and inventor. His portrait graces the $100 bill. He embodies the American dream, but he was never president of the United States. This myth seems absurd once debunked. How could anyone think Franklin was a president? Yet, sociological surveys conducted in various countries consistently show a significant percentage of people, especially non-Americans, who are convinced that Franklin held the presidential office. The mechanism behind this myth is clear. A portrait on currency is often associated with the presidency. Washington is on the $1 bill, Lincoln on the $5 bill, Jefferson on the $2 bill, and Hamilton on the $10 bill. Interestingly, Hamilton was also never a president. He was the first Secretary of the Treasury, but the association with money persists. Franklin's actual career is far richer and more interesting than any presidential term. He served as the governor of Pennsylvania for 3 terms, making him the oldest governor in the state's history. He was the first Postmaster General of the United States, and he served as the American ambassador to France during the critical period of the Revolutionary War, securing a French military alliance that was essential for the success of the American Revolution. His scientific experiments with electricity, including the famous kite experiment during a thunderstorm, were serious scientific endeavors and not merely flashy tricks. He developed the theory of electric charge, introduced the terms positive and negative charge, and invented the lightning rod. The Royal Society of London elected him as a corresponding member. Franklin was the oldest of the founding fathers and passed away in April of 1790, just a year after Washington was inaugurated. He signed not only the Declaration of Independence, but also the Constitution and the peace treaty with Britain, 3 documents that defined the existence of the new nation. No one else signed all 3. He was never president. He was something even more significant. The next myth also revolves around the mismatch between image and reality. This time, it's about the brutality we often associate with the past. Myth number 23. Executions no one saw. When we think of medieval executions, we picture massive crowds in the public square, a festive atmosphere, children riding on their father's shoulders, vendors selling pies, an execution as a public spectacle, entertainment for all classes, a noisy, brutal theater of death. This image is deeply rooted in popular culture, in novels, films, and TV shows. While it's not entirely false, public executions were indeed a part of the medieval legal system. The reality is much more complex than a carnival surrounding the gallows. First of all, not all medieval executions were public. Many executions took place in prison yards, witnessed only by official figures, a judge, a cleric, the executioner, and a few witnesses. This particularly applied to those convicted of crimes that the authorities preferred to keep quiet, or those whose public execution might turn them into martyrs. When executions were public, the crowd's reaction was often less straightforward than we imagine. Historical accounts describe instances where crowds intervened on behalf of the condemned, prompting authorities to reconsider the sentence. They also recount tears and loud weeping among the spectators. There were occasions when the executioner struggled to carry out the sentence efficiently, prompting the crowd to react negatively, not against the execution, but against the poor performance, which was seen as a slight against the condemned. Medieval public executions were primarily legal rituals. They were meant to demonstrate the triumph of the law, rather than just serve as a spectacle of death. In most cases, the condemned were given a chance to speak BGK their death, confess to a priest, and receive communion. This wasn't humanism as we understand it today. It was a religious procedure aimed at ensuring the soul's salvation. Yet, it added a dimension to the execution that went beyond simply killing for the crowd's amusement. Furthermore, the idea of public executions as entertainment is a narrative constructed in later times. It was during the 18th and early 19th centuries, as Enlightenment thinkers began to criticize public executions as barbaric, that the image of the Dark Middle Ages emerged, consuming death as entertainment. This narrative was useful for reformers, as it emphasized the contrast with the enlightened modern era. Executions were indeed a part of medieval life, brutal, without a doubt. But the Carnival of Death is a late projection, not a historical reality. The next myth revolves around a different kind of cruelty, specifically scientific cruelty. Myth number 24. The vaccine that wasn't tested on humans by chance. July 6, 1885. Louis Pasteur, the French chemist and microbiologist, stands before a painful choice. He has been brought a 9-year-old boy, Joseph Meister, who was bitten by a rabid dog just 4 days prior. 14 deep bites. Without treatment, death was virtually certain. Pasteur had developed a vaccine against rabies, tested on dogs, but never on humans. It was a risk. It bypassed scientific protocol. It could have killed the boy. But the alternative was certain death from hydrophobia. Pasteur made his decision. Meister was given a weakened rabies virus, 13 injections over 10 days. The boy survived. This became one of the greatest triumphs of 19th century medicine. However, the myth of chance in this story is entirely fabricated. There is no version in which Pasteur accidentally tested the vaccine on a human. The decision was conscious, agonizing, and thoroughly documented. Pasteur recorded all his doubts, calculations, and processes in his journal. He consulted with colleagues. He was fully aware of the ethical and legal implications. So where did the myth of chance come from? Likely from a romantic desire to make the story more dramatic. A brilliant scientist risking everything in a moment of tragedy and emerging victorious. Chance adds an element of fate or providence to the narrative. The real story does not need embellishment. Pasteur did not accidentally test the vaccine. He made a conscious decision to violate scientific norms in the face of a child's imminent death. This was a complicated ethical choice, not a fortuitous accident. The distinction is crucial. Interestingly, prior to Meister, Pasteur had considered other cases, several adults bitten by rabid animals, but postponed administering the vaccine each time due to insufficient time since the bite or uncertainty about the diagnosis. In Meister's case, everything aligned: a recent bite, a confirmed rabies diagnosis corroborated by autopsy, and the certainty of death. This was no accident. It was a precise, cold, and courageous necessity. Next, we'll explore another myth about tough decisions made in challenging contexts. Myth number 25. Dissidents not sent to Siberia. To be sent to Siberia is a well-known expression in Russian and worldwide, denoting a harsh exile to the most remote places. In the collective conscience, a Soviet dissident is almost invariably an individual in a padded coat against a snowy tundra. The reality of Soviet repression against dissenters was much more varied and, in some aspects, far more sophisticated. First of all, the very notion of Siberia as a place of exile was applied unevenly. During the Stalin era, the Gulag system covered vast territories, including Kolyma, Vorkuta, and Magadan. The Gulag camps were spread across the entire Soviet Union, in the Moscow region, in the Urals, and in Kazakhstan. Referring to Siberia as a synonym for repression simplifies the reality of the geography involved. Secondly, and this is crucial, in the post-Stalin era, starting in the 1960s, the regime developed an instrument that many historians consider to be more brutal than physical exile. This is the realm of punitive psychiatry. Soviet psychiatry created a special diagnosis: slow-progressing schizophrenia. Theoretically justified by Andrei Snezhnevsky, this diagnosis was unique to Soviet psychiatry and was not recognized anywhere else in the world. The essence of the diagnosis was this: a person who systematically opposed the Soviet authority must be mentally ill, because a normal person would not willingly invite trouble upon themselves. Protests against the system were seen as symptoms of a mental illness. Dissidents were placed in specialized psychiatric hospitals, colloquially referred to as psychiatric wards in Russian slang, where they were treated with antipsychotic medications that caused severe side effects. This was not only physically devastating, but politically lethal. How can you take seriously the arguments of someone officially labeled as insane? Pyotr Grigorenko, a Soviet general and human rights activist, spent several years in psychiatric hospitals. Vladimir Bukovsky gathered and smuggled evidence of punitive psychiatry to the West and was condemned for it. Natalia Gorbanovskaya, a participant in the protest on Red Square against the invasion of Czechoslovakia, was also placed in a psychiatric hospital. None of them were in Siberia in the sense that is commonly implied by that phrase. The myth of Siberia as the universal Soviet response to dissent obscures a far more complex and sophisticated system of repression. The next myth revolves around an event often considered scandal-free. Myth number 26, an uncontested Olympics. Athens, 1896. The first modern Olympic Games. In our minds, it paints a beautiful picture, an international celebration of sport, friendship among nations, a revival of ancient ideals. However, the first modern Olympic Games were filled with scandals, political intrigue, disqualifications, and organizational chaos from the very start. Let's begin with the participants. The Games were planned as an international competition, but most countries didn't send official teams. Instead, many sent random tourists, students, and military personnel who happened to be in Greece at the right moment. The American team was mostly made up of students from the Boston Athletic Club, who found out about the Games just weeks earlier and paid for their trip out of their own pockets. The British delegation was so small that many participants from the British Isles ended up competing for other countries or as individuals. The marathon, the highlight of the Games meant to replicate the legendary run of the Greek warrior from Marathon to Athens, concluded with the victory of Greek runner Spiridon Louis. The Greeks rejoiced. Princes accompanied the winner across the finish line, marking a moment of national triumph. However, the first across the finish line was another participant, Spiridon Bolokas, also a Greek. He was immediately disqualified upon it being revealed that he had traveled part of the distance in a cart. This was not a mistake or a lack of knowledge. It was deliberate cheating in the main event of the Games. In cycling, another scandal erupted. The champion was accused of using performance-enhancing substances, a topic that had already sparked sports debates, and the organizing committee altered the rules several times during the competition, and the composition of the judging panel was contested by the athletes. The Greek government intervened in the committee's decisions under pressure from nationalist sentiments. In other words, the first modern Olympic Games were much more similar to all the subsequent ones than we might like to admit. Next, let's tackle the myth about a great construction. Myth number 27, a wall built not for Mongols. The Great Wall of China, the longest defensive structure in history, constructed over centuries to stop the Mongol nomads from the north. This is widely known, but it's incorrect, or at least incomplete. Let's begin with the timeline. The first fortified walls in northern China were built during the Warring States period, between the 5th and 3rd centuries BC. This was 1,000 years before the Mongols appeared as a historical force. The walls were erected against the Xiongnu, the Huns, and other nomadic tribes that changed over the centuries. The Mongolian threat is a specifically late medieval context, long after the walls had already existed for centuries. Moreover, the Great Wall that we see in photographs today, with its brick towers, level crenellations, and Taurus viewing platforms, primarily dates back to the Ming Dynasty, specifically the 14th to 17th centuries. This is relatively modern history in the timeline of Chinese civilization, and it was constructed after the Mongolian rule, when the Mongols had been expelled but the threat from the north remained. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China who unified the country in 221 BC, ordered the connection of existing fragmented walls into a single system. This was a colossal undertaking, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of laborers. However, this was not the first or main phase of the wall's construction. It was just one of many. Paradoxically, for all its length, the Great Wall proved to be militarily ineffective. The Mongols, led by Genghis Khan, conquered China. The Manchus also conquered China. the Xiongnu raided for centuries. The wall did not stop armies, it merely slowed down smaller units, provided a signaling system, and served as a base for border troops. It was infrastructure for managing the frontier, not an impenetrable barrier. Thus, the story of the Great Wall is not merely one of a construction project aimed at a single enemy. This is a millennia-old story of Chinese states building relationships with the nomadic world through a complex mix of military strength, trade agreements, diplomatic marriages, and yes, physical barriers. The next myth revolves around another barrier, a crisis that was closer to the end of the world than we might think. Myth number 28. The crisis that wasn't the only one. October 1962. Soviet missiles in Cuba. An American blockade. 13 days on the brink of nuclear war. In school textbooks, quite rightly, this is described as the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, when humanity stood at the edge of the abyss. That's true. However, this narrative gives a misleading impression that this moment was unique, suggesting that before and after, the world was safe. It wasn't safe. There were other moments when nuclear disaster was chillingly close. November 1983. NATO's exercises, codenamed Able Archer 83, practiced a scenario for transitioning to nuclear war, with such realism that the Soviet leadership, documented in declassified files, was convinced this was not just a drill, but preparation for a real strike. The KGB received intelligence that NATO was urgently mobilizing its nuclear forces in Western Europe. Soviet nuclear forces were put on heightened alert. Several factors, including the presence of Soviet agents inside NATO who confirmed it was merely an exercise, helped avert disaster. But for several days, the world teetered on the brink of war, unaware. September 1983, just weeks before Able Archer. Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov, on duty at Early Warning Systems, received an alert about the launch of American missiles. 5 rockets headed toward the USSR. According to protocol, he was required to report the launch to command, which would automatically trigger a retaliatory response. Instead, Petrov did not report it. He reasoned that a genuine attack would involve not 5 missiles, but hundreds. He was correct. It was a satellite malfunction. But at that moment, he couldn't know for sure. One Soviet lieutenant colonel, acting against orders, may have prevented a nuclear exchange in 12/10/73. The Cuban Missile Crisis is the most well-known nuclear moment of the Cold War. GDK wasn't the only one, and perhaps not the closest to catastrophe. GDK next myth deals with how we paint people in one-dimensional strokes. Myth number 29. Monks who did everything else. A medieval monk. In popular imagination, a quiet figure in a dark robe, endlessly bent over manuscripts by candlelight. Prayer, copying texts, silence, a humble life outside the world. In reality, medieval monasteries were so multifunctional that it's hard to describe them with just one characteristic. Monasteries were banks. The church prohibited usury, charging interest, from lay people. However, monastic orders found legal ways to effectively engage in lending, renting instead of borrowing, and gifts instead of interest. Monasteries accumulated vast wealth and financed construction, trade, and even wars. Monasteries served as hospitals. Their infirmaries provided medical care to pilgrims, the poor, and travelers. Monk physicians studied Arabic medical texts translated in Toledo and Sicily, applying ancient and Islamic medical knowledge in practice. Monasteries were also breweries. This is not a metaphor. Beer and wine production was one of the key industries for monasteries. Water in medieval towns was often unsafe. Beer was a safer and more nutritious option. Monastic beer was a standard product, sold in markets, and served as a source of income. Monasteries functioned as inns, hospitals in the etymological sense of the word, from the Latin hospes, meaning guest. The rule of Saint Benedict mandated the welcoming of travelers as if they were Christ. Monasteries along pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, and Jerusalem provided lodging and food for thousands each year. Monasteries were centers of technological innovation as monastic orders introduced and refined watermills, mechanical clocks, and agricultural practices. The Cistercians became renowned masters of hydraulic engineering, creating complex water supply and drainage systems for their monasteries. And yes, monasteries copied manuscripts, but this was just one of many activities. A thorough description of all their duties would shatter the image of a quiet scriptorium as the sole monastic reality. The last myth is about a civilization we consider well-studied. Myth number 30. The history we don't know. Ancient Rome, arguably the most studied civilization in history. Thousands of Latin texts, legal codes, historical chronicles, architectural monuments, coins, inscriptions, and frescoes. We know more about Rome than any other civilization from the ancient world. But this is an illusion, based on the relative abundance of sources. Let's start with the most obvious. Everything we know about Rome has gone through the filter of scribes. Throughout the Middle Ages, texts by ancient authors existed only in handwritten copies transcribed by monks. A scribe, no matter how diligent, was not a neutral conduit. He might make errors, correct what he thought were mistakes in the original, or omit parts he found confusing or inappropriate. Each generation of copies introduced its own distortions. Some famous ancient texts were written or significantly revised in the Middle Ages. The Gestae Romanorum, Deeds of the Romans, was a widely read medieval anthology that contains stories attributed to Rome that are actually medieval inventions. The challenge remains to distinguish authentic ancient texts from medieval forgeries, a task that continues to be a focus of philological research. Yet beneath these issues with sources lies a more fundamental problem. Our understanding of Rome is primarily through texts written by a narrow segment of the educated elite, predominantly male, and largely from the senatorial class, based in the city of Rome itself. A vast part of the Roman Empire, its provinces, lower classes, women, slaves, soldiers, merchants, and farmers, remains largely silent in the records or speaks through intermediaries who often distort their voices. What don't we know about Rome? We don't know exactly how Latin sounded, there are no sound recordings, and reconstructing pronunciation is a matter of debate. We lack a clear timeline for the early centuries of Roman history. The period of the kings and the early republic is known to us through sources written 500 to 700 years after the actual events. Livy, who describes the founding of Rome and its early wars, lived in the time of Augustus, 700 years after Romulus. The Great Fire of Rome in 6020 AD destroyed a vast array of documents, administrative, historical, and literary. No one knows exactly what was lost, as descriptions of the vanished texts have largely not survived. Then there are Herculaneum and Pompeii. These cities, buried under volcanic ash in 6020 AD, have preserved a wealth of information about daily life, graffiti on walls, tavern menus, love notes, and trade announcements. This is a rare window into a reality often absent from official sources, and a significant portion of these materials remains unexamined and unpublished. In other words, we know Rome from the perspective of the educated elite. We know a Rome that has made its way through medieval scriptoria. What we don't know, or know only in fragments, are the stories of slaves, soldiers, provincials, women, and artisans. And they represent the majority of Rome. The notion of a well-documented Rome is a myth, created by those who have read enough to believe they possess complete knowledge, yet not enough to recognize the vast dark spots on the map of that knowledge. 30 stories. 30 moments when reality turns out to be richer, stranger, and more human than the simplifications we often use to replace it. What connects all these myths? It's not malevolence or a conspiracy of liars. Most of them arise from understandable human needs. We crave unblemished heroes. We seek simple explanations. We strive for order in the chaos of the past. We need recognizable villains. We want great events to have dramatic human explanations. We want the civilizations we admire to be understandable and whole. Reality refuses to be so compliant. Washington sat in a boat because otherwise he would have drowned. Marie Curie knew the danger and faced it with her eyes wide open. Medieval monks brewed beer and lent money. Apostles debated politics. Mongols conquered China through the very wall that was supposedly built against them. The first flight by the Wright brothers was met with silence. History isn't just a tale of heroes or a tragedy. It's something rarer and more valuable, an unpredictable, intricate, and detail-rich truth about how people lived, made mistakes, innovated, deceived, suffered, and, at times, achieved something truly great. The archives remain open,